welcome back for your after coffee break, after lunch, or pre-car. I've lost the track of the time. There's so many events today. Welcome to T104. We're going to be looking at packaging strategies in this session. So just by word of quick introduction, for those of you that weren't bored to tears with me yesterday at the Content Delivery Summit, my name's Dom Robinson. I'm one of the contributing editors and writers for Streaming Media since 2002. By day, I run a software company focused on microservices for delivering premium live streaming online and so on. Do come and find me afterwards if you want to talk about that. But what we're really interested in is talking about packaging with these experts. And I have a great panel with me today. We're going to be looking at the very cutting edge of packaging strategies. So can I just work across the panel briefly and ask everyone to introduce themselves and tell us about your specific focus when it comes to, particularly when it comes to packaging. David, please.
Hello everyone, my name is David Syed. I work in the Microsoft Azure cloud organization in Redmond, and my focus is on figuring out what we build next around media workflows and products. And one of the things that we've been doing for a long time as part of Azure Media Services, as well as prior to that, before the cloud days with IIS Media Services, is dynamic packaging, and working closely with a number of the other folks here on the panel around those topics.
Well.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Will Law with Akamai. I'm Chief Architect in the Media Division there. I also work in the Dash Industry Forum and in the CTA Wave project, which if you don't know what that is, then it's okay. It's a group of companies trying to solve some problems with OTT. So I'm involved both externally outside Akamai in the industry with a lot of partners, vendors, and also trying to make OTT more efficient in general, not only within Akamai, but for all vendors in the community.
David.
Thanks. I'm David Heppe with Imagine Communications. And Imagine Communications has a portfolio of products that we sell into the broadcast and cable industries. I'm responsible for a group that focuses on the distribution of content as well as ad insertion. And we work with the rest of our company on the ad tech side that makes a lot of back-end advertising management systems. So our group focuses on distribution, for primary distribution as well as for OTT and connected TV, and doing some dynamic ad insertion there. So relevant topic.
Perfect. Dirk.
All right. Well, my name is Dirk Griffioen. I am one of the founders and CEO of Unified Streaming. In short, what we do is we provide software to build media workflows with. So that includes static packaging, dynamic packaging, DRM. We have about, I think, 100 plus customers worldwide. And for instance, the BBC uses dynamic packaging, whereas HBO uses static packaging. So it would be interesting to share what we've learned through the years.
Okay, and before we sort of go straight into the panel, can I just get a quick straw poll of the audience? Who here is very technical, on the very technical side, and wants to go technically deep? Pretty much half, I'd have said. And who's more on the business proposition and the sort of value chain? Okay, there's a few of you out there. Okay, cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just to set the scene, and let's just go rewind before we get into the current day. Let's just look at what packaging is and what the understanding of packaging is across the panel, and just understand how it's been done, sort of since zero until now, if you like. So, David, what would you consider a broad definition of packaging is from your point of view?
So I think packaging, if you think about, you have a piece of media content that you need to deliver. I would say for the past, must be 10 years or so now that we've actually been doing what's called adaptive bitrate streaming over the internet. And the way that works is you actually take your media file and you encapsulate it in one of several different formats, and this is where one of the topics that Will brought up earlier comes in, and you essentially create chunks of these of the media fragments that you can then deliver over the public internet. So it's just HTTP traffic. And then your device is able to read those chunks and put the media file back together again, as well as to switch up and down to different resolutions and bit rates depending on the quality of the network connection. So part of the secret sauce that makes all of that happen is having a packaging format that can traverse the internet and that can be played back or interpreted by the appropriate devices I think, Will, maybe a good segue to talk about, CMAF and the different packaging formats that exist out there and how that all helps.
Are we going straight to CMAF? Because that's going to be a little...
You can do, but let's sort of make sure we haven't missed any details in your understanding.
Yeah, so
Each,
just
hear
again,
from each of you if there's
with
any
on a
minutes.
high level with packaging, a lot of us, we buy an encoding box and we put video on the one end and segments and text files come out the other end. And people call that packaging. I think we should decouple encoding or transcoding from packaging. And in many more sophisticated workflows, they are indeed highly decoupled. An encoder is going to create the actual audio and video content, but it may be a continuous stream of content with keyframes or SCSI markers inserted into it. That's going to go into the packaging solution, which is then going to potentially physically cut it and at the same time prepare the presentation format, which would be HLS or dash, that describes the availability of this content. Packaging systems can operate statically in general, meaning you prepare the content well ahead of time before it's requested, or dynamically, which is you do it just in time when the content's requested.
Perfect. David, anything to add to that sort of broad picture?
Yeah, so things that are produced by the packager include the fragmented bits of video itself, as well as a manifest, and the manifest is used to describe to the player where to get the next URLs or where to go grab the next fragments in the video sequence that you're wanting to play. And the manifest becomes a very important element in the overall food chain because that can be used to be manipulated to replace content and do things like blackout or alternate content insertion as well as ad insertion. And it also is at the core of this difference between HLS and dash, the manifest itself.
Dirk, any details to add?
Yeah, if you look at dynamic packaging, we sort of there's a distinction when there is a packager and there's an origin. So in our case, the origin and the packager is the same thing. So it's a web server that does fulfill a player request just in time. So say you have MP4 on disk produced by the encoder, then the web server produces the client manifest or the dash or HLS content as it goes, as the request is done. So there's no separation between packaging and origin, which is sometimes a cause for confusion. So just wanted to make that point.
So just a little point of clarity. Each of you have mentioned manifest and chunking and so on. Before we go into sort of more exploration of the different types of packaging in those areas, what do you guys think of what I would call packaging in formats like RTMP and WebRTC, which are not necessarily chunked? Would you include those in the packaging space?
No, it's all HTTP based, which is basically file serving. So if you look at RTMP or RTP or WebRTC or all those SRT, all those
session-based protocols.
Yeah, session-based streaming protocols. MPEG-2 is one over UDP, for instance. In the case of OTT and adaptive bitrate, that's just, we call it streaming, but basically it's file serving over HTTP.
Okay.
So.
Although we should also separate contribution from distribution. So on the contribution side, we're still seeing some streaming formats, SRTs becoming popular. Yeah. You can use MPEG-TS coming in, you can use WebRTC coming in, and then it gets converted. But certainly for scalability on the delivery side, it is definitely shifted towards HTTP. Yeah, and HTTPS and H1, H2, and now H3, and all the derivatives of HTTP that's coming out.
Yeah, so you can use a CDN and it's over port 80 and it works everywhere.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's dig into today's contemporary packaging formats and techniques. What's out there on the market? What are you guys supporting, and we'll come into what's coming next. Let's start with what's out there in the market, and what are you guys supporting, David?
So the main protocols that we see today are HLS, which is Apple's original specification, and MPEG-Dash. There are other formats out there as well. There's the Microsoft Smooth Streaming format. There's we still see some of the Adobe HDS format out there as well. I would say those are the main ones that we tend to see in the wild. But predominantly HLS and Dash is what we tend to see.
Do you see HLS transport stream or more a transition to fragmented MP4 and HLS?
So starting to see both. Definitely, we're seeing a lot of interest in the fragmented. In the FMP4 CMAF style HLS as well. Especially for people who are trying to do who want to do AVC as well as HEVC.
So HEVC is only specified for fragmented MP4.
Indeed,
Right.
yeah.
And likely all new codecs for Apple will be inside a CMF container. So it's definitely the more future-proof one on the HLS side.
Yeah.
Okay, should we do the CMAF bit? Oh no, go on.
No,
Dirk.
interestingly, Apple doesn't say that you should use CMF. They say in the spec it's an example of a fragmented
Yeah.
MP4. There's some nuance they want to keep there.
But they released the capability well ahead of the CMAF spec being actually published. So it was
Yeah.
descriptively called fragmented MP4, which CMAF is a restriction on. So I think as we go forward in the years, we may see stuff come out of Apple that actually explicitly references.
Yeah, and like on the Apple developer side, like one of the example files for fragmented MP4 HLS, that's formatted differently from CMAF. It still
Yeah.
works, and they're sort of like not trying to put all their cards on the table, it seems sometimes.
But MPEG is revisiting CMAF right now. There's brands. CMFC was meant to be this universal brand that would play on all Apple devices, and when we built conformance tools and went to test it, realized no, in fact, it was the content that was primarily used for Dash and also for Apple wasn't satisfying some of the constraints, and that there was a sub-brand CMF. So they created a more relaxed brand, CMF2, and MPEG have just made the decision to go back and rename the CMFC to be CMF2 because the intent was this was the grandfathered, more relaxed profile, and that CMF2 would in fact become the more specific profile designed to allow seamless switching without reinitialization.
Seem to be a party in the other
Yeah,
room.
we're missing the party next one.
Maybe now's a good time to have our own party and for Will to tell us what CMAF was designed to do.
So,
Yeah.
so CMAF's this development of CMAF was designed to address inefficiency in packaging. So still today, if you look at a big CDN, you'll see the same video file being delivered in HLS with TS segments, so audio and video encapsulated inside a transport stream file container, and then on the Dash and on the Smooth and on the HDS side inside fragmented MP4 containers.
And it's
of
all
some
the
form.
same video.
And it's the same video, but it's costing you twice as much to store it, and when it goes into the CDN, it halves the cache efficiency because they got to fight for the limited cache space, and then you have to build players that know how to parse both those containers in order to extract the same common audio and video. So a group of companies got together, spearheaded by Apple and Microsoft, who, to their credit, had been strong competitors up till this point, but they realized that the tide needed to lift both boats at that point, and they worked on something initially called a common media format, which was its name what it says it is. Let's agree to use the same box to put all our audio and video in. And that way we can simplify our encoding, simplify our packaging, for my prior comment, encoding separate as the codec, and we can make CDNs more efficient, and the players can be more efficient too, because now we have this one workflow that we're focused on. And MPEG in its wonderfulness renamed common media format to be common media application format, because that's what they call it when you combine containers with codecs, which is what they did, and hence the name CMAF, Common Media Application Format. This was standardized 1.5 years ago now, and it's supported actually more, 2 years, because it's supported across the Apple ecosystem for the last 2.5 years, and it's supported by Dash from the beginning for 6 years, because CMAF's essentially the Dash file container with
ISO
a
BMFF.
few additional restrictions. So we have this interesting space now where you can prepare one set of audio and video files and then write two manifests against them, a Dash manifest and an HLS manifest. And remember the disparity in size. A video segment can be 500 or 200 or 1,000 times larger than the manifest. So the cost of storage and the cache issues are all directly related to audio and video. And we can still happily provide two independent text files, which are essentially our manifests. And I think as we get into the discussion, we should also look at, when you say dynamic packaging, there's dynamic synthesis of audio and video segments and dynamic synthesis of manifests and playlists. Mm-hmm. And those can be done in very different places and with very different levels of efficiency.
Well, can I
Go for it,
make two comments? One is, when you look at DRM, like the end game, of course, is that you have the same content in the CDN and have two manifests like point to that content. But still, like Apple requires CBC, and the rest do CTR, although PlayReady and Widevine did add CBC like encoding mode. But still, if you now look at what people deploy, it's still like for HLS and for the others, basically 2 copies just encrypted differently. That's still for a time to be. That's one remark. So the end game is there's one thing. What was the quote? There's one to rule them all, which maybe a bad quote. And the other thing is, like, we had a deployment where the party in question had a CDN of their own, and so they used the software we provide, run it on the edges. So you use not the storage within the CDN, but also the compute power on all the edges. Then you said just fragmented MP4, one copy within the network, and when it goes to a user or a viewer, you create HLS, or you create Dash, or you create, is that something that is still in the back of your mind? Or?
No, that's exactly what Akamai built 8 years ago. So we have a product. So Akamai is an interesting company. We have a dynamic packaging solution, exactly that. We have a static packaging solution, and we're trying to move towards a no packaging solution. And each of these are rational responses, so I can explain them. Dynamic packaging was built in a time when there were many input formats coming in. We had Smooth, we had HDS, we still had Move networks around, we had HLS, and we had Dash starting to show.
QuickTime.
And QuickTime. So lots of files coming in and files going out. So we needed to build something dynamic. And as Dirk mentioned, if we can take MP4 as our sort of base container, in fact, we used FLV because this was 2010 and Flash was popular. And FLV is a very simple container, actually, so it's easy to manipulate. We actually use FLV, take that to the edge, the actual edge server, and at the edge server synthesize TS containers and ISO containers holding the content that was inside the FLV. This has been deployed for a long while now. And it works. But the one reason we started to get away from it is when a machine at the edge has to make things instead of simply passing them through, its overall throughput becomes less. By a factor, for us, by a factor of half or 2/3. So we can get much more output on a machine if it's just moving objects out than if it has to synthesize the object before it makes it.
Put more CPU in it.
Well, then we get into, the cost.
Reasonably big expense when you've got
So
hundreds of thousands of servers.
We did a lot of analysis. We're still running this system, but what we said was we see CMAF coming down the pipe. We see a future where most of the media segments will be common, and we want to leverage that.
Yeah.
And at that time, the price of storage was declining faster than the price of compute. So if you want to leverage what's getting cheaper 3 years from now, it's certainly storage. So that motivated a lot of our decision to move more towards static packaging, certainly for VOD, because we said it's easier to just prepare the 2 copies up front and store them and deliver them. And yes, we then have cache contention at the edge as long as they're different, but as CMAF becomes more popular, the downside of cache contention at the edge goes away. And then we get the cost efficiency of cheaper storage, and we can use our CPU at the edge, which is for us a more scarce resource, for things like key generation, manifest manipulation, and some of the more interesting things we need to do at the edge for per session features.
Will, do you see then like dynamic packaging moving more towards a long tail? Because storage, it's cheap, but if you have 1 million, if you have 2 million items in your catalog, which you have to do still in multiple renditions, of course, if you're a VOD platform, typically is 80% of the viewers or 20% of your content, which you can package statically, which you can cache well in the CDN. And then you have an enormous long tail of movies nobody ever watches.
So I think the place to do the dynamic packaging is further up the stack and not at the edge, because then you get the efficiencies of not storing the content twice, but without necessarily the CPU hit.
Okay.
So we are also looking at what you might call mid-tier packaging for a subset of content where it makes sense. And for items like live streams, so we're talking VOD versus live. But
and would you see, like in the future, there's, for instance, a high-res mezzanine floating around within the network, and there's transcode at the edges, because there's, like in 5G projects, ideas floating around in that direction.
yeah, we would transcode at the edge is a chronically expensive idea for us.
Okay.
And it might be efficient if you're selling 5G networking equipment.
And
but it's
then an edge, I think, is defined as something else.
So maybe origin edge, maybe yes, but I'm talking CDN delivery edge.
Mhm.
We do not want to do transcoding then.
No.
Okay, so we've talked about the emergence of CMAF, or the coming together of the various formats to lead to CMAF and so on. Are you guys seeing CMAF as to use your expression, Dirk, as the one packaging format to rule them all? Or do you think that it'll lead to a rapid deprecation of other formats, or do you think that it'll be just another one on the landscape?
Something new will be along soon enough.
Let's start with David this end.
Well, I think being pragmatic, it's going to depend on devices aging out. There are, customers are going to want to deliver content to all of the devices that they need to support. That tends to depend on the geographies that they're serving, and there are definitely going to be some devices out there that aren't able to consume CMAF content, and so they will continue to need non-CMAF formats. However, I think like everyone else here, we're seeing a groundswell of interest in CMAF because people delivering media at scale see the economies of scale that CMAF is actually able to provide, especially in terms of having to deal with the multiple DRM formats, because that typically, if you're dealing with premium media, premium content that needs to be encrypted with different DRM formats that need to be native for the specific device for power efficiency and performance and so on, as well as sometimes the content licensing requirements, CMAF really helps to solve that, again, in the fullness of time with the different encryption specifications that Dirk and Will just mentioned earlier. So, CMAF, I think, is going to become the predominant format, but depending on the customer that we're talking to, some of those customers will continue to need the more legacy formats that exist today.
David.
Yeah, I think it's a super good thing for the industry. It's going to help drive costs down, make things more operationally efficient. With my business hat on, I kind of shed a tear a bit because we made a little bit of money on packaging over the years, and that need is not going away immediately, as David said, but it will be dampened. I think CMAF just makes a lot more sense functionally, and it's the right direction for the industry to go.
I think we're naive if we're thinking CMAF's going to take away all need to prepare some strange derivative. That's going to stick with us forever, because there's codecs, and in Silicon Valley you can do CMAF all day this week, but down in Brazil, it's not going to happen for several years. You've got a lot of old TVs. They all love Smooth. Actually, Smooth is one of the biggest formats in Brazil, and
there's usually a non-compliant version of Smooth because it was using a beta version of the porting kit that was never actually finalized.
Yeah. So there's a lot of regional requirements to prepare things. So you can never, people come to me and say, well, CMAF's not working because the world's not 100% on it. It's never going to be that way. If it can get to 80% of the world's on it, that's a win, and that's as good as it's going to get. Because after that, we go into codec diversity, which now we start making silos of stuff all over again. So we're never going to get down to one copy for everybody.
And I think if I can add to that, I think that's one of the areas where dynamic packaging coupled with potentially technologies like device detection actually end up being interesting, because with device detection you could then determine, okay, this device that's requesting my content is a legacy iPhone that only can play back an older version of HLS, but I need to be able to deliver my content with the original English language, but also French subtitles and maybe English subtitles as well. Great. How do I do that in that older format version of HLS? Well, I need to package for that particular device. And so having the ability to dynamically do that, especially if the content is long tail, and be able to provide the specific format that device actually requires, is very helpful in terms of securing device coverage that OTT platforms, for example, actually need.
So I think it's quite clear to understand what benefits that dynamic packaging bring, certainly in terms of some storage, in terms of network caching and so on and so forth.
They cost as well.
But does it add any overheads? Is there any loss in moving from a static to a dynamic process?
Well, one thing is that with static packaging it's conceptually quite straightforward. So you have files and you have a process that produces different files, which then go to net storage, CDN. But with dynamic packaging you somehow have to manage a service that's should be online 24/7. So in the case of web servers, you have to run them, you have to auto-scale them, you have to monitor them, you have to do some quality of experience. So it's changing from like I output files, I have quality control files, and then I ship files, to I maintain a service. I have an ops team that is responsible for that maintenance.
And two other downsides of dynamic packaging. There are upsides, but the two downsides, as I mentioned, is CPU consumption. It's more expensive computationally to make things. And the second is time to first byte on both manifests and segments. It's longer to make something than it is to simply deliver it off the file system.
How much longer are we talking?
You can't put a number, because how big's a manifest? How powerful is your machine?
Is it something that the user's going to notice? Is it in the sort of microsecond experience, or is it?
It's not tens of milliseconds and it's not seconds, but it might take.
It's below second.
It's below a second, but if you're dealing with a 1 second startup time and you've added on 600 milliseconds to make something, then that's meaningful.
No, but that's only one guy, and the rest is cached.
Well, I was going to say, yes, so you do that once or a few times.
Or you can preload caches.
Yeah.
Well, not for live, but...
True, but if we're doing like per-session encryption now, per-session encryption you can't statically prepare it.
We are seeing the industry moving to that concept of a mezzanine format that they're standardizing on throughout their plan, and this is in our MVPD customer base. And so now they're moving everything over to Dash SIF, and they're gladly getting away from the old Comcast version of Dash. And now there's this industry standard version, the SCSI T104, I think.
Yep.
And so there's that precedent for customers recognizing, let's simplify our operations and have one common mezzanine. And today that's what we have for Dash, but then they'll be easy to migrate to a CMAF type of deployment.
So it's not always completely apparent, but one of the great things about dynamic packaging we found in some of our lines of business is that we can take different audio channels, different PIDs for different sources of data, and bind them together just at that late binding dynamic packaging, just-in-time packaging. They were kind of reasonably synonymous, yeah. And I think those advantages are they've certainly been really important for a lot of our clients. You know, we've got many languages, financial needs getting bound together, and we're trying to get certain languages with certain resolutions bound together for certain devices. So that late binding process is very important. Do you guys find that people are using packaging just to take static files and effectively, or static encodings, and package them out on the fly, but adding in certain bits of metadata, or how are people applying dynamic packaging in their workflows in practical use cases?
Well, whether you use static or dynamic packaging is orthogonal to the use case you just described of having multiple languages. That's late binding of audio and video, meaning you've separated them into separate files, but you can prepare those files ahead of time, or you can prepare those files dynamically. Yeah. The fact that you've separated them is orthogonal to how you make them.
Well, dynamic packaging also, you can go one step further. If you look at VOD, it's files on disk. If you have live streams, that's something coming from an encoder. But if you add a playlist into this, a playlist that you can like tailor dynamically towards, there's a certain user, you know who it is, so you can give them some like pre-roll or something like that, or you can do scheduling. So I have a VOD content, I have VOD, but I want to present it as live. So say I want a theme channel, I want a Star Wars channel, I have some movies, but I don't want to put it all online like people can click, but to program it, like you can do that with a playlist, and that playlist you can like stitch together dynamically. So I think dynamic packaging adds use cases that you can't do with static packaging.
I think the killer app is dynamically generated manifests referencing statically generated files.
Okay. So
because now you get all the customization that Dirk just described. You can manifest manipulation is a gold mine and a toolbox if you want to get into it. You can do so many cool things, and you can do them efficiently at the edge for per session or higher up the chain. And you can add security, you can add tokens, you can add envelope encryption, you can add and remove language sets, so you can customize the package of content that the player is going to receive. But it's referencing a set of content that may or may not have been prepared dynamically. It doesn't matter, but the manifests certainly can.
And a really good example is like ad insertion or pre-rolls of something. Let's say you want to do promos, and they're different for a certain group or another group. If you do it like for personalization, you have, I don't know, ads that are personal, and say the content is the same. You have a 1 hour movie, and then you have, say, 1,000 viewers. They all get like a different pre-roll. Then typically the CDN says that's 1,000 different URLs. And although the main content is the same, well, the pre-roll is not. So if you can refer through the manifest to the CDN, and that's the 1 hour content is statically packaged. It's inside the CDN, but the pre-roll is generated dynamically. It goes through the CDN to some origin that generates it dynamically. Well, you have an interesting use case.
So one of the preamble questions that I picked up on discussions we had before, Will, you mentioned watermarking and how that
so that's an interesting case of packaging combined with dynamic manifest generation. So there's a lot of schemes for A/B watermarking today, where you basically make two derivatives. Each version of the segment contains a different mark, and then they're combined in a unique permutation, or is it combination? I forget my high school statistics. I think it's permutation. They're combined in a pattern that's unique. So that has to be done per session. So you generate a unique manifest for that user at that time. Yeah. But you're referencing, in this case, statically packaged content that holds the watermark.
Pre-encoded with the watermark in,
Yeah, it's two files with the same content, but no more, and the rest is just a selection.
And so you're preserving cache efficiency by
Yes,
doing
we
that.
are. So you've got two objects, but at least you don't have 10,000 or 50,000 objects, which is what you would have if you actually embed a unique watermark in every single object.
Right. Are you seeing wide adoption of those sort of technologies? Actually, this
well,
is across
as
all
we
of
get
these.
into more UHD distribution, movie labs issued watermarking as a requirement.
Yeah, it's mandatory, right?
It's mandatory. I see a lot of UHD without it, though, so it's mandatory, but there's no police to enforce it quite yet. But we can expect it to become a requirement, just like DRM. People know it's an arms race. It gets broken, it gets deployed, and everyone grumbles. But that's a requirement. I think watermarking will make it there too. There's so much fraud going on today for movies, and they're so expensive to make that they're going to mandate whatever reasonable protection is they can to try to stem that.
Then if we look at the live use case, especially with sports, that's another area where needing to have a fairly strong, personally identifiable watermark is actually useful. And I guess the two ways of doing that would be the way that you described, or doing it at the edge in a more forensic type of way on a per viewer basis, so that the viewer who's then videoing the stream and putting it up on YouTube can be identified. Obviously, you don't want to do that up the stream within this before it hits the CDN, because then you're busting this cache efficiency.
Okay, so I'm going to come to the floor for some questions in a second, so start getting your grey cells working. But got an interesting question, actually, which Dirk, you shared beforehand, which is that you put forward the idea that with this with this evolution of dynamic packaging in the market, you put forward the question: do you think there are other parts of the video delivery workflow that could benefit from a more dynamic workflow as well? Which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, we touched upon that just now. So there is, like, if you look at personalization towards ad insertion or watermarking, or anything that, involves some kind of user idea that's helped by dynamic packaging. Whereas if it's, one size fits all, that's static packaging.
Any other thoughts?
I think transcoding is one for certain use cases. You're not going to want to, at least in my opinion, try to dynamically transcode everything. But in the case where you've got certain long tail content in your VOD library in particular, you might want to have the common set of bit rates that people are actually consuming, that you identified through your QoS, QoE statistics, maybe sort of throw in some machine learning in there to be buzzword compliant, and then you'll
no
guarantee
AI, please,
that.
No AI.
Then you that's a bad word, is it? Then you hit the play button, and everyone at least gets video to play. But then, as that long tail piece of content gets played, the ABR stack gets built up by dynamic transcoding. I could see that being another use case.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. We did some analysis on that, because you get the cost trade-offs of the cost of CPU versus the cost of storage, and over time, what's that projected to do? So it's some pretty interesting. You need to look at the statistics of how frequently people are going to play things, and It's a complex analysis.
But then, you look at some of the technologies that Jan was talking about earlier with the per title encoding stuff, and, if you can get an ABR ladder of, maybe five different bit rates and resolutions, that might be good enough for most people. Obviously, we're not talking about UHD in that context.
Yeah.
So just one last question for me. For people who've been static packaging and have sort of a legacy workflow that they're looking to refresh or renovate, renew, and move to a dynamic packaging architecture, have you got a few words of advice each for steps they might take towards preparing themselves to do that?
I guess I'll kick off. First of all, it's really ultimately it's about the use case. There are definitely certain use cases where a dynamic approach just may not make sense. If you know exactly the kind of devices that are hitting your content, you don't need to refresh that type of content, or the packaging formats. You're not really doing a lot of DRM content. Maybe static is the right solution for you. Otherwise, there are definitely areas where dynamic makes a lot of sense. I would encourage people to look at, again, depending on your architecture, you may be interested in a more of a DIY approach to doing that, or you may be interested in more of a managed service way of doing it, or indeed doing it within the context of the CDN. Ultimately, it depends on the use case as well as your architectural and technical skill set to accomplish that.
Will, anything to add to that?
That was a great answer.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to it is, besides looking at the applicability, really look down into what you can do with manifest manipulation, text file. You can do powerful things there and achieve a great degree of personalization. And very interesting, you can even go into something like changing the video storyline, like for the person. Like now we put ads and we put primary content, but what if the movie that you get is actually stitched together dynamically by assembling various options to create the story that you want? Technically, we can absolutely do that. We just need the business case. So there's interesting areas like that where you can really take manifest manipulation and create a business element.
David, any thoughts on advice for
people? I think a lot of it is looking at for live content, how many channels are you having out there, and how many different devices and bit rates are you trying to support? And I think in most cases, for most customers, they've got a fairly broad range, or at least the big customers, they've got a broad range of looking what they want to support, and it makes sense to move to a just-in-time packaging type thing. You may have a mezzanine first, and then just-in-time package as those requests come in, so that you can, handle the full gamut of what's out there in the market, but not have to pay too much for, packaging everyone all the time on streams that aren't going to be watched.
So it's a little bit of a numbers game in the planning,
yeah.
And Dirk, any other tips for people looking to move from static to dynamic strategies?
I think that's been chewed over quite well by now.
Okay, we've got any questions from the floor? We'll start at the front and work backwards, please. There we go.
Hi, I'm coming from the United Nations, and our biggest challenge is the multilingual streaming that we do. We've been doing mostly everything sort of static packaging, where we stream the video over and over again with the embedded audio, 7 times for our official languages, and then storing it that way, which of course is expensive on the bandwidth, expensive, on the storage, on the CMS side. What's your recommendation sort of for the future? Because we're sort of looking at better ways of handling multilingualism and kind of reducing our costs.
So if the future's tomorrow, you should go and decouple your audio and video. You're going to save by a factor of 10 your storage and your content prep cost.
Both on streaming and on demand? Or?
Yeah, for instance, the European Parliament runs single video stream in 27 languages, and they've decoupled indeed. So they have like all the audio tracks and then the video track. Video once and the rest is audio. So that works pretty well.
I'd agree with that.
Do you know here where we can talk to people who sell encoders? Because our current encoders...
The European Parliament runs Unified.
Okay, our current encoders can't handle this, which has been a problem. So maybe I'll talk to you.
Right, more questions. Sorry, let's track backwards before we start selling.
Yeah, hi, Glenn Goldstein from Viacom. So we're sort of on a journey now where we're actually moving from dynamic packaging to static packaging, but a hybrid, as Will sort of described, where it's heavy. We dynamically generate all the manifests. To do things like content stitching, Pluto TV, we're totally assembling these virtual linear channels, stitching manifests. But the way we've attacked the move to static, it's It's not exactly like we're doing at publishing time, where we have a whole packaging cache and it's all disposable, and we can just on the fly, on demand, trigger repackaging only without doing re-encode, and that's been an interesting strategy. It's kind of a hybrid of dynamically triggered static packaging, if you will. So sort of toss that out there. But I wanted to ask about packaging formats and challenges around closed caption and subtitles. We've been having all sorts of challenges with the web VTT packaging for HLS. I haven't looked at it too close on the Dash side, but is there sort of a CMAF-y common approach now for, is it web VTT or TTML?
No. IMSC1 inside a CMAF container. If you want to standardize your captions, go there. It's supported across the Apple ecosystem. It's supported within the Dash standard. It's supported within CMAF as a media profile. And IMSC1 handles all the captioning requirements from Asian languages, people left to right.
No more
pictographic.
bitmaps.
Yeah, bitmap.
Yeah.
So it's the
actually quite
superset.
similar to the original DFXP. It's more
Yeah,
or
but
less
it's at least a standard that's been agreed upon. It's in version 1.1, 1.2, but we're definitely seeing a lot of traction for
And does
that
it
right
get,
now.
is it chunked? How does it get chunked?
You
up?
can write it into a text file, but again, the preferred means of delivering is to put it in the same ISO container that you're putting your audio and your video, and again, late bind it.
Yeah.
But it can be packaged on its own all
It
by
could be
itself
packaged
as
as
a
a-
separate track, right?
Yeah.
For VOD, you can package it. Yeah, it's a separate track. So the player's requesting audio, video, caption. Audio. Now, it might not request for live. It's got to request short bursts of captions. But for VOD, it could make one request and get a long.
Are we seeing the majority of common HLS players all handling that now?
What do you mean, common HLS players?
That's sort of a loaded question. I'll look at it.
Do Apple players handle it?
Yeah.
Yes. Do non-Apple players handle it? I'd say no.
Probably not. Most of them handle the
Will they
package
over
VTT.
time? Yes. The more people, if Viacom starts using it, they'll start handling it.
All right, I'm in.
More questions? More questions? No? Everyone gone quiet now. You threw some acronyms out and everyone went quiet. Okay, so what do you guys see as the future for packaging over the next few years? Give me the story in 2025.
God,
David.
put me on the spot.
All
2025.
right, let's put Will on the spot.
Yeah, go on, put Will on the spot.
Yeah, we always think it's going to be totally different. So it'll probably be pretty much the same as it is now. We'll be dealing with a lot more codec diversity. I think we'll have AV1 or AV2 by then. We'll have VVC. We'll have EVC. We'll still have AVC. So we'll have codec diversity. Hopefully we'll have container standardization. So, and we'll have coalesced around CBCS probably by that time. So we'll have that common. Yeah, there's laughter in the. You said 2025? Yeah. Okay. I think.
It's only 6
Far
years
enough out.
away.
Yeah.
You're really going.
And I think
Let's
we'll see a lot of movement on the manifest side. I think manifests are going to get more complicated. They get more and more decorations added to them for new features. So the simplicity that's been in old, I think you'll see HLS get more complex. Dash is already complex, so that will persist. But they're addressing a complexity of use cases. So OTT is growing up. It's not the adolescent anymore. It's having to reach some of the technical requirements and the stability
Yeah, well, it's sort
of
of
broadcast.
It's sort of building a broadcast workflow with the reverse direction, where the typical broadcast was built up over 80 years, and we're doing it in less than 8.
That's true.
And I think we'll also see, in addition to the video codecs, we're going to see activity around audio, which has somewhat been forgotten about. We're already. I think last week Netflix published a paper about how they're doing up to 512 kilobit audio streams, which is pretty chunky for audio, right? And I think we'll start to see some more of that. We'll also start to see some interesting additional data tracks, I think, that might be getting carried around some of the personalization aspects that were talked about earlier.
I'd say I think you're totally right about audio. There's a sort of, without wanting to start too much of a rumour, we've been talking about a bit more of an audio-specific focus within streaming media, because I'd say with the day job I had on, we probably spend 60-65% of our time actually messing around with audio stuff for people who are trying to do relatively simple video things, but the audio is where it all gets tangled up. So. Any more crystal ball?
I think two things. One is that we'll still see a lot of smooth streaming in Brazil, like Will said. And we're actually seeing interest in adoption of this fragmented video and packaging for primary distribution by some of the broadcasters as well as MVPDs who are on fixed satellite or leased line streaming technologies now, which are very high cost and very inflexible. And they really like the idea of moving to this OTT stack of technologies that's been proven and is improving. And as latencies get better and you get the benefits of manifest manipulation and being able to change content for different zones and things, I think you're going to see adoption of these technologies in those types of workflows.
Dirk, last comments, last crystal ball gaze into 2025?
Yeah, I think there will be a lot more dynamic use cases. So, and then not only downstream from an origin, so like at CDN edges, but also upstream, because you can move a lot of like that workflow. If you look at ad insertion or scheduling or etc., you can move it all upstream, so behind the origin. So like a player only sees a single URL, and all the magic happens upstream. But in either case, whether it's downstream or upstream, there will be a lot more dynamic stuff going on.
Perfect. Look at that. We hit exactly on 3:30. Can I get a round of applause for an excellent panel?